Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully you all are having a wonderful day today. So anyways, I thought that I would review this little video that I found very, very interesting. And of course, this news is going to be about Mr. Gervonta Tank Davis, who in my opinion is one of the most talented boxers throughout the whole entire world right now, and throughout the whole entire sport. And apparently from what I'm hearing, Gervonta Tank Davis may finally be in another A-grade matchup very, very soon. And this will potentially be the biggest victory of his career, or at least the biggest fight of his career, of course, if he could end up pulling out that victory. And of course, this fight is potentially going to be against Gary Russell Jr., who I believe is a champion at, I'm not sure if it's 130 pounds or 126 pounds, I can't necessarily remember, but I believe that it is 130 pounds. Gary Russell Jr., I do think, all in all, is a very talented fighter. He's a very speedy fighter. He's decently strong. I think, all in all, that he does have decent boxing ability. However, when I do take a look at this boxing matchup, I don't necessarily know if Gary Russell Jr., I don't know if he's going to have the size. And even though I do think he has excellent boxing ability, I don't think that he's going to have the boxing ability, in my opinion, to outbox Gervonta Tank Davis. If you're asking me all in all, what percentage would I give Gary Russell Jr. to defeat Gervonta Tank Davis? I would say that Gary Russell Jr., in my opinion, I would maybe give him about a 20 to 30% chance. And certain people may think that I'm underestimating him a little bit, but I just think that Gary Russell Jr., even though I think that he's extremely talented, Gary Russell Jr., he is a little bit light in the ass, in my opinion, for Gervonta Tank Davis, especially a Gervonta Tank Davis, because Gervonta Tank Davis is a dude that he could probably fight even at 140 pounds and fit right in. Now, he's not someone that is super lengthy or super tall, but Gervonta Tank Davis, he is a dude that is very, very decently built for his size. So we're going to see overall if this fight were to happen. I'm going to be talking about this fight, and if Gervonta Tank Davis were to get the victory in this fight, what do I think this would mean for his career? How big of a fight do I think that this is? Let's get into it. And this is, of course, going to be a video by Fannon International Boxing. Let's get into it.
All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fannon. Man, great news if this, what I'm hearing, is true. Gervonta Tank Davis may be fighting Gary Russell Jr. next year at 135 pounds. I am ecstatic about that because that is a great fight for a lot of different reasons. Let's talk about that in this video. Welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fannon. Before I get into the meat of the video though, man, please make sure you hit that like button as you come in the video, and if you forget on the way out, hit that like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed. Man, I'm excited about this, man, because this is a rumor, this is something that has been said by Leon Muhammad. If you're familiar with Leon Muhammad worked with Bob Arum, worked with Don King. Has been a figure in boxing for a long time. You see his interviews up over on YouTube a lot for boxing conversations, man. Sometimes he hits it on the head, sometimes he doesn't. However, I think that that's usually the case with pretty much everybody, right? So Leon Muhammad says, according to reports that I'm getting, that Gary Russell Jr. and Gervonta Tank Davis are in talks, and that those guys should be fighting next year. Now, obviously, there is a fight for Gary Russell Jr. that's going to be coming up, I do believe, in late January, early February, against Mark Magsayo, a mandatory fight for him. But after that, this is something that Gary Russell Jr. has been calling for a while. He's been calling out Gervonta Davis for at least 2 years, and he's been saying, look, man, Gervonta Davis needs to fight me because that is a fight that is going to do well in the gates anywhere we go.
I would agree with that. I would think that Gervonta Tank Davis, like I said, they're clearly trying to make him a pay-per-view star. And in my opinion, so far with the pay-per-views that he has had, of course, with the exception of this last one against Isaac Cruz, I think that the majority of the time his numbers have done really, really well. And I personally did not buy the last fight against Isaac Cruz because, once again, I didn't think that there was really any point to. A certain amount of people, like Dante's Boxing Nation and a couple of other people, they tried to, really twist it, and say, oh, well, this is really a great fight because Isaac Cruz is someone that, is prospect of the year and all this other bullshit. But Gervonta Tank Davis, like I said, he was facing someone that he had no belt. He was not within the top five of the division. And on top of that, he was the same size as Gervonta Tank Davis, pretty much, if not even a little bit smaller. So it's like, what appeal was there really for that fight? That would be like if Canelo Alvarez, if he were to face someone at 160 pounds right now, like I said, that would be like if Canelo Alvarez, if he fought someone like a David Lemieux. That's in my opinion who that would be like. Now, if you want to say that Isaac Cruz is more skilled than David Lemieux, be my guest. But like I said, that's pretty much to me what that would be like. There just would be no major reason for a fight like that to happen.
And it's going to do excellent on pay-per-view, and it's something that I really do agree with. But more importantly than that for me, it is a fight for Gervonta Davis against a guy that is a highly, highly skilled boxer. It is something that is not the same thing that we've seen.
I believe that he's highly skilled, but I don't personally believe that he's going to be as highly skilled or would be as much of a challenge for Gervonta Tank Davis as, say, a Josh Taylor would be, or a Vasyl Lomachenko, or, I'm trying maybe to think of someone else. Well, really, in my opinion, those are the two biggest threats to him. Now, some people may say, well, why don't you bring up George Kambosos or Devin Haney? I think that those guys are threats. I think that those guys are A-grade fighters, but I don't think that their style of matchups, in my opinion, or their skill sets, I don't think that they're going to do extremely well over Gervonta Tank Davis. Maybe Devin Haney because, he's a very rangy fighter. He's very lengthy for the division. And in all honesty, he's probably a natural 140-pounder anyway. But when it comes down to it, Vasyl Lomachenko is a person that, in my opinion, he actually is a very huge threat to Gervonta Tank Davis. Now, of course, he recently lost to Teofimo Lopez, but styles make fights. Why do I think that Vasyl Lomachenko is such a tough matchup for Gervonta Tank Davis, possibly? Because Gervonta Tank Davis and Vasyl Lomachenko, they're very similar in height and reach. And Vasyl Lomachenko is a person that has possibly the best foot movement and head movement and angles that Gervonta Tank Davis is going to see out there. So in my opinion, Vasyl Lomachenko, he does have that recent loss to Teofimo Lopez. Vasyl Lomachenko is still a very dangerous fighter. And in my opinion, it does not seem like Gervonta Tank Davis is super duper interested in him, but it is what it is. But like I said, a Gary Russell Jr. fight, that would be decently acceptable. But I am hoping, after the Gary Russell Jr. fight, that perhaps maybe he faces someone overall like a Vasyl Lomachenko or Josh Taylor or Devin Haney. If you're able to beat Gary Russell Jr., that would for sure put Gervonta Tank Davis, in my opinion, at, within my top 10 pound per pound, because kind of like him and Lomachenko, they're both debatably in my top 10 pound per pound right now. But if Gervonta Tank Davis were able to get a win against the Gary Russell Jr., that would for sure put him in my top 10 pound per pound, undebated, undoubtedly, anyway. So it's not like a Gary Russell Jr. fight does not do anything for his career, is what I'm trying to say.
For Gervonta Davis, if you want to call it the Mayweather method of fighting, which has been, to set up Gervonta Davis with flat-footed fighters that he could easily outbox or that he could beat because he was just so much better a boxer than they are. Like, a lot of people think of Gervonta Davis as somebody that's a come-forward fighter and a knockout artist type of guy, because of what they saw with Lee.
Well, he is a knockout artist, but Gervonta Tank Davis is a great all-around fighter. That's why I say Gervonta Tank Davis, when I take a look at him, out of any other recent fighter that has came out of the Mayweather gym, I've been the most impressed with Gervonta Tank Davis. Gervonta does not always seem to make the best decisions outside the ring. He seems to sometimes get into a little bit of that hood rat mentality. But when it comes down to it, Gervonta Tank Davis is a boxing genius. He is a person that is a very good boxer. He has very great athleticism. And on top of that, he has very great skills. He seems to be pretty decently, defensive, or what I will say is that he has very decent defensive skills. Although last time, maybe he could have showed out a little bit better. But Isaac Cruz is a decently tough opponent. I don't think that he's an A-grade opponent, but he is a B-grade opponent in my opinion. So Gervonta, he was still able to pull off the fight. So that's good for him. But my big question overall is this. Are you going to be able to defeat the Devin Haneys, the Vasyl Lomachenkos, the Josh Taylors? Because those are the guys, in my opinion, that they're around that top 10 pound per pound point. So we'll see what happens. Because if Gervonta Tank Davis beats Gary Russell Jr., I think that that's a great win. That's kind of like how Terrence Crawford, when he beat Sean Porter in his last fight. Now, I think Gary Russell Jr., I think that he's more skilled than that of a Sean Porter, at least when you take a look at it on the surface. But at the end of the day, Gervonta Tank Davis is going to be a decent favorite over this guy. Now some people may say, well, you say this about Gervonta Tank Davis. Why don't you say this with Canelo when he faces Billy Joe Saunders or Caleb Plant, because in my opinion, Caleb Plant and Billy Joe Saunders, they're pretty much on that same level with David Benavidez overall, and that of a, Jamal Charlo, and that of a Demetrius Andre. They're all somewhat on that same level. You know, they're all somewhat of multiple weight division champions, at least some of them. So like I said, Canelo I don't really criticize too much because he has fought so many A-grade fighters, and in my opinion, there's not really one of those fighters that stick out to a great degree. But Gervonta Tank Davis, I would like to see him face Vasily Lomachenko. Josh Taylor, I would love to see a Gary Russell Jr. fight as well. I think that that's a very decent fight, but I do think that it's going to take a little bit more than that of a Gary Russell Jr. for Gervonta Tank Davis to get a real test in. But we'll see what happens.
Santa Cruz and what they've seen with what they saw with Mario Barrios, and but what you saw in the fight with Jose Pedraza when he originally won his title, what you saw in that last fight with Pitbull Cruz, Asoc Pitbull Cruz, is that this guy is a world-class boxer, man. The dude can he can control the distance very.
I agree with that. Gervonta Tank Davis, in my opinion, he certainly is a world-class boxer. He can fight going forward. He can fight going backwards. He moves very decently well. He seems very defensively responsible. So we'll see overall what happens.
Very well. He goes from offense to defense spectacularly. He's got very, very fast hands, feet. He anticipates well. All of those things are in that repertoire for Gervonta Davis, but we have not, as of yet, seen Gervonta Davis in the ring with somebody that I would call also a boxer puncher, because that's what I think Gary Russell Jr. is.
I would agree as well. And that's a part of the reason why, even though I think that this is a fantastic fight, and I certainly would buy the fight, because I think the fight would be worth some, but, this fight, like, if I had to compare it, it would probably be like a, I'm trying to think of, like, what to compare this to. It would almost kind of be like, when Earl Spence Jr. fought Mikey Garcia, or somewhere along those lines. Or when Vasily Lomachenko maybe fought Guillermo Rigondeaux, except I don't even know if I'd put it on that level, because Gary Russell Jr., in my opinion, he's not a person that I would put within the top 10 pound for pound. But it's a great fight. I think that it's a very decent fight, but, it's kind of like a lesser version of Mikey Garcia versus Earl Spence Jr. or Vasily Lomachenko versus Guillermo Rigondeaux. It's kind of like Terrence Bud Crawford versus Yuriorkis Gamboa, in my opinion. That's kind of what it's like. But we'll see. Now, of course, Gervonta, he's not as lengthy as some of those guys compared to some of the other ones, but Gervonta is going to be decently sized over Gary Russell Jr. So we'll see what happens in terms of just weight and stature.
Gary Russell Jr. is another guy that is a boxer puncher. He's a guy similar to Isaac Cruz that is kind of a small dimensions, but he has very fast hands. He's got good pop on his punches, has excellent footwork, and he is somebody that is going to engage in a fight.
This fight reminds me of like if Canelo Alvarez were to face a Jamel Charlo. Like Jamel, of course, he's one of the top fighters today, but when I take a look at Jamel versus Canelo, I'm like, Jamel, he's got some skills. I think he is an A-grade fighter, but I just don't know if he's going to beat Canelo. You know what I mean? But we'll see what happens.
Somebody that's running around on the back foot, but, very similar in that regard. And I think that a fight like the actual fight between Gervonta Davis and Gary Russell Jr. is a matchup of two top-level, highly skilled fighters, and that is something we do not see enough of in boxing.
Well, I think it's a matchup between one fighter that's A+ in terms of his skills, and I think that it's a matchup against another fighter who is maybe about an A, I would say, or A- in terms of his skills. But I could be wrong. Gary Russell Jr., he could put up much more of a fight. Gary Russell Jr. has shown me in the past that he is a very good boxer, but the biggest matchup of his career, which of course was the Vasily Lomachenko fight, he pretty much got embarrassed. And I don't think that he's ever fought a fighter that has ever anywhere near been on the same level overall as a Vasily Lomachenko. I mean, I've seen him outbox Jojo Diaz. He looks, let me give him his credit. He looked pretty decently impressive against Jojo Diaz. Maybe Jojo Diaz wasn't as experienced at the time, I don't know, but when that fight did happen, Gary Russell Jr., I remember him completely embarrassing Jojo Diaz. I think I scored the fight like 9-3, which is around the same score that I pretty much gave it for, Devin Haney over Jojo Diaz. But let me actually give Gary Russell Jr. this much credit. I thought, for example, that Gary Russell Jr. was more impressive over Jojo Diaz than what Devin Haney was. I would say that Gary Russell Jr., that he's all around more of a skilled boxer than that of a Devin Haney, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to have more of a chance than a Devin Haney, because Devin Haney has some of that reach, he has some of that length. Now, Gervonta, once again, he's not the tallest dude, he's not the lengthiest dude, but I don't know. But once again, that's not to tear down this matchup. That's just me giving my analyzation of who I believe personally is going to win the fight. And I do think it is going to be Gervonta Tank Davis. I think more than likely, if Gervonta Tank Davis comes in at 100%, I believe that'll probably knock him out somewhere around the 8th or 9th round. But we'll see what happens.
Now, also, I'm not going to lie, I'm happy for Gervonta. I would be very, very happy for Gary Russell Jr. if he gets the fight, because that would be his first really, really big fight that he's had in his career. He has been at 126 for a very long time. Champions and unification fights have come and gone.
Well, he wasn't a very big fight when he was still undefeated against Vasily Lomachenko. Of course, Vasily Lomachenko, he was not looked at as the same type of fighter at that point in time that he would be a little bit later on. But of course, Vasily Lomachenko, he pretty much completely embarrassed him. So, I don't know. We'll see what happens here. But, it'll be very, very interesting.
Him on a regular basis. It's very hard to name any guy that has a belt at 130 pounds right now that is not at 126 with Gary Russell Jr. and for one reason or another did not fight Gary Russell Jr. at 126. And it seems like that trend is continuing. I believe that's because of how good a fighter Gary Russell Jr. is. And you saw what happened when guys that he has beaten, like Jojo Diaz, what happens when he moves up in weight. Jojo Diaz moved up, won the title at 135 pounds by beating Tevin Farmer, moved up to 135 pounds, beat Javier Fortuna, and then
Tevin Farmer was one of those guys that, he was always looked at as one of the more elite fighters because he ended up getting that upset win over Ivan Redkach. But in all reality, Tevin Farmer, he's a decently slick boxer, but he's never going to be someone that's A grade. And on top of that, he has no power in his hands whatsoever. So I remember when the Tevin Farmer Gervonta Tank Davis fight was actually talked about, and a bunch of people thought that was going to be a super fight. And just looking back at it now, Gervonta Tank Davis, he probably would have knocked that dude out within the first 4 rounds, at least debatably.
Fought Devin Haney, I believe, had pretty much a what level type of fight with Devin Haney that he had with Gary Russell Jr. two weight classes below. So I'm really, really excited for the fight for Gary Russell Jr. and for the fans in that area of the country, provided that they actually take that fight to Baltimore or they take that fight. Probably, I would suspect that the most likely place for that fight would be New York, New York City, where that fight again would sell out, man, because Gary Russell Jr. is a very well-known name and respected name in boxing. Also, as far as the going up in weight for Gary Russell fighting Gervonta Tank Davis, I don't really think that. I think that it is something that is doable and fair and still a fair fight, because Gervonta Davis is really not, as far as height and length and all of that, he's not that much bigger than Gary Russell Jr.
Well, no, he's not, in terms of length and height. And this is what I was saying. He's not, he's not much taller, or he doesn't have that great of a reach advantage over Gary Russell Jr., if at all. But once again, Gervonta, he's like, he's almost like one of those running backs that you see over in the NFL, like a Christian McCaffrey or, maybe like a Saquon Barkley. They don't look super tall. They're no more, taller than 5'11", but they can sometimes get up to like, 220, 240 pounds. They're just, solid muscle. That's kind of like what Gervonta Tank Davis is. He's a person that, he's short and, when it comes down to, he ain't too lengthy, but he's a person that, like I said, just because overall of his stature, like overall like his muscle and the type of weight that he can rehydrate to, like he can even compete at 140 pounds, no problem.
I do believe he's a little bigger than Gary Russell Jr., but I don't think the height advantage is as extreme as it was for, say, like the Isaac Cruz fight. But, Gary Russell Jr. is he's kind of a stocky, smaller guy. Gervonta Davis is a stockier and a guy that's not quite as short, but absolutely terrific matchup in there, man. And I think that is something that should do very well on pay-per-view. Now, one of the things that I wonder is whether or not, what happened with the Isaac Cruz fight may lean Floyd Mayweather and them to say, let's try to get Gervonta in there with an established name, somebody that can really, we believe, can bring, a a really big fan base to it. Now, obviously,
Well, Gary Russell Jr. should be able to bring a decent fan base to the fight. Gervonta Tank Davis, like I said, he is a star in himself. So Gary Russell Jr. or any talented fighter that he is going to face is going to get a lot of views, undoubtedly. But, there's no offense, to the Floyd Mayweather team, but to be quite honest with you, and I have a lot of respect for Floyd Mayweather Jr., one of the greatest fighters of all time, but they have really been protecting Tank Davis for a very, very long time. I mean, it's almost getting to that point now to where, I believe now he has 25, 26 fights in his career, and you've only fought one A-grade fighter. I mean, I guess I'll give you more credit than some of the other fighters that I've seen. There's certain fighters that, they had 30-some fights on their record and they had no A-grade fighters, like a Deontay Wilder or a Leo Santa Cruz. But, at the end of the day, it's like, you got to start facing some of these big names, man.
Gervonta Davis and Gary Russell Jr. are both Black American fighters, so their fan bases are probably gonna, intermingle a good bit. But what you have is you have that dynamic between Baltimore and where Gervonta Davis is from, and where Gary Russell Jr. is from, being in DC. And that area alone, you're gonna get a lot.
That's a good point. I think that that may be a part of it.
Pay-per-view buy,
or they could promote something with that.
You're going to get it, and if they happen in that area, you're going to have a lot of people going to that fight because of the rivalry between the two cities, and not just the rivalry, between the two fighters. Now, that may be a little bit hard for people from the United States not to understand, but that is I understand in the UK that happens as well, where you really do have regional rivalries between cities and fighters that come between cities. I don't think in the United States you really have a city rivalry between two cities in the United States that is bigger really than, or more, and honestly I have to say more deadly really than Washington D.C. and Baltimore.
That certainly can be a great rivalry. Philadelphia and Brooklyn, that's another one. That can be a little bit of a rivalry. There may be some other ones as well, but I get your point.
They're only maybe I want to say 45, maybe less than an hour away from each other, right? Right down a highway from each other. They have a shared airport in BWI, right? I do believe BWI is where people fly into Baltimore. They might actually have a Baltimore airline, but it's Baltimore, BWI. That airport, people land into and go to both cities. People travel between the two cities a lot, so that could also bring a lot of names and a lot of money to the fight. But all in all, man, I certainly hope this is true. Would be great news for boxing in 2021, in 2022. I personally would probably lean towards Gervonta Davis winning the fight because of the age, but do not lunch.
I don't even think I would favor him just because of the age. I don't really know one category besides hand speed that Gary Russell Jr. beats Gervonta Tank Davis in. And, Gervonta Tank Davis, like I said, when you take a look at his style, he can handle almost anybody, at least from what I've seen so far. Now, will he be able to handle the real, A-plus fighters later on? We'll see. But, at the end of the day, Gary Russell Jr., that might be a good start. That certainly is, a win that, in my opinion, would be a great win. So, I would not necessarily have a problem with this fight, but I just don't think that Gary Russell Jr. would have the greatest of chances over Gervonta, because even though I think that he's a better boxer than what most Gervonta Tank Davis has faced, I just think that Gary Russell Jr., once again, I think that he's just a little bit too light for him. And on top of that, once again, who really has Gary Russell Jr. beat in terms of A-grade fighters? Once again, that's not me, at all trying to tear down this fight. That's just me giving my analysis on why I think Gervonta Tank Davis wins. Gervonta, like I said, he's at least been in the ring with guys that, are bigger, rougher, and just bigger built, and probably have more power than that of a Gary Russell Jr. Gary Russell Jr., I guess you can say that he's a boxer-puncher, but, in some of his bigger fights, who really besides Johnny Gonzalez, has he really knocked out? So that's why I just don't have a lot of confidence that Gary Russell Jr. is really going to make this a super-duper tough fight, maybe for a couple rounds. But, Gervonta Tank Davis, if I had to guess, more than likely, he's probably going to be the one pressuring in this fight, and eventually he's going to clip Gary Russell Jr., and I do believe that he is going to knock him out.
Gary Russell Jr. is a very live wire in that fight and an extremely, extremely talented fighter. And I do believe that no matter what, it's going to be an exciting fight because neither one of those guys are going to dance around the ring. Anyway, so that's
well, Gary Russell Jr. better dance around that ring, otherwise he's gonna get smushed. It's no offense against Gary Russell Jr., but you can't just go straight at Gervonta Tank Davis, or I'm not saying that maybe don't go at him sometimes, but you can't just pressure him the whole entire time and just expect to completely beat up Gervonta Tank Davis. It ain't gonna happen that way. There's only one fighter, in my opinion, that if they were to pressure Gervonta Tank Davis, they would have a legitimate chance, and that's Vasyl Lomachenko. Because he has enough power, he has enough skills, he has enough head movement, he has enough size on his side to possibly give Gervonta Tank Davis that trouble. But Gary Russell Jr., in my opinion, I don't know if he's going to be able to have that ability, but we'll see what happens.
It's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.
And that's really all I got on this video. But anyways, thought that was a decent video by Fannon International Boxing. Thought that I would talk on that real quick and give my little opinion about Gervonta Tank Davis versus Gary Russell Jr. possibly happening. I do think that is a good fight. But like I said, to me, this fight is as if, if Canelo were to face Jermell Charlo. It's an A-grade fighter, and perhaps maybe it's even higher than that because Jermell, in my opinion, he's not as skilled for his division as what Gary Russell Jr. is. But I think Gary Russell, I think he's a very scrappy fighter. I think that he's a very decent fighter. But the real test for Gervonta Tank Davis, at least the litmus test, in my opinion, about is he going to be, a future all-time great fighter? Gary Russell Jr., of course, is a great fighter, but, the real test, in my opinion, for Gervonta Tank Davis is those are going to be the Josh Taylors, the Vasyl Lomachenkos, and the, what's his name, Devin Haney's. Possibly, George Kambosos and Jose Ramirez and Regis Prograis as well. Those would be very decent fights as well. So we'll see what Gervonta Tank Davis does, but it'll be very, very interesting. Anyways, that's pretty much all I got for today, at least for right now. I'll talk to you all later.